Morning, guys. We're talking today about Jacksonian democracy. Like always, any additional notes you want to jot down on your handouts. And we're first going to start talking about John Quincy Adams. So we're leaving the era of good feelings. We're leaving the era of one political party, lots of things getting done. But remember also that that was a misnomer because there were some internal conflicts as far as debate over tariffs and debate over slavery and some other things of that nature. But we're going to go ahead and jump into this election. And the first election is the election of 1824. So it's important to note that all four of these candidates are Democrat Republicans. So they're all sort of on the same ticket. They do have some differences, and we're going to talk about each one of those. So Andrew Jackson is the first from Tennessee. His nickname, of course, is Old Hickory. That comes a little bit later in his political career. Someone says, Jackson, you're as tough as a piece of old hickory, like a piece of wood. So the name kind of sticks. Not the best nickname of all time, but it's what he's stuck with. The next candidate is going to be Henry Clay. We've talked about him. He's the author of The American System. We talked about that last week. Our third candidate is unknown at this time, William H. Crawford from Georgia. And then we have, of course, John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams from Massachusetts. John Adams, highly intellectual, very experienced, but sort of an introvert. Doesn't make friends easily, and that's going to cause him some problems a little bit later on. And again, it's important to note these are all Democrat Republicans. We can also start referring to them now as Republicans because we're going to see a split, which is going to create two distinct parties here in just a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about the election. So as far as vice president goes for this election, we're talking about John Calhoun, vice presidential candidate with Adams and Jackson. John Calhoun's from the South. We'll talk about him a little bit later, but he is sort of pro-slavery for economic sake down there in the South, and he's going to want to protect his constituents, and we'll talk about him in just a minute. So he's going to be vice presidential candidate with Adams and Jackson. Jackson is going to win the electoral vote with 42.16%. That's a problem because that's not a majority in the Electoral College. So he doesn't become president automatically. We have to find out who's going to be the president, and so it's going to go to the House of Representatives, and they're going to have to choose between the top three candidates. Okay, so they choose between the top three, and because of that, Clay is out. So now we're left with three candidates. We're left again with Jackson, Crawford, and now John Quincy Adams. So this is the election of 1824. So what ends up happening, Henry Clay, he is Speaker of the House. He has a lot of power, and he has sort of the power to support whomever he wants to support. And so if we go back in time, we'll look at how he and Jackson never got along for multiple reasons. So that's going to be very influential in the election of 1824. It's going to help out John Quincy Adams tremendously. What also is going to help these two gentlemen, at least, Jackson and Adams, is that Crawford is going to have a stroke before he can actually be put up to ballot and be voted on by the House. So Crawford has a stroke. He's paralyzed. There had been support by Monroe and Jefferson for Crawford, but now what we have is an election between two major rivals. We've got Jackson and John Quincy Adams. Jackson and Henry Clay become rivals for votes in the West, and Henry Clay and Jackson are sort of they are rivals. Andrew Jackson is from the West, Tennessee. So Henry Clay is going to do everything in his power to take away some of that support so he can get his non-enemy, John Quincy Adams, elected to president in 1824. Okay, so let's talk about why Henry Clay didn't like Andrew Jackson. And there's a few reasons. Andrew Jackson didn't like how Henry Clay had criticized his activities in Florida. Actually, Jackson had gone into Florida during what we call the First Seminole War. This is under James Monroe as president. He forced Spain to basically sell Florida to the United States. And of course, Jackson went in with the assumption of if you can't control Florida, Spain, then you need to either provide a military dictatorship, which I'll gladly run, or you need to just give it up so the United States can handle it, because there was a lot of uprising going on in Spain's kingdom at the time, and Florida was no different. So Jackson goes in and starts his sort of Indian policy of killing, murdering, moving them off potential land for white settlement. And so Henry Clay had criticized him for this. So that's just one of the very many reasons why Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson didn't like each other. Okay. Um, he was the only one for Henry Clay to support was John Quincy Adams. So it was pretty easy for Clay. He may not have agreed with everything that John Quincy Adams stood for, but he was definitely not going to support Andrew Jackson in this election. Because of all this criticism by Henry Clay to to Andrew Jackson, he had tried to censure Andrew Jackson 4 times when he was senator for Tennessee. So this feud kind of goes back a long, long way. So the two men, as far as were of Jackson and Henry Clay, they were fairly similar, but again, they had nothing in common personally. They were both nationalists, and they were actually for the American system. So here's a picture of Henry Clay. Okay, I don't like you, Andrew Jackson. Okay, I'm going to get my people to vote for John Quincy Adams, which is the gist of what you need from the election of 1824. So Clay throws his support behind John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams wins in 1824. Okay, so again, you need to know that date, 1824. A few days after, Henry Clay was appointed Secretary of State. Oh my gosh, that seems unlikely. No, it seems likely. And this becomes known as the corrupt bargain. Henry Clay basically said, not directly, but I'll help you, you help me. And John Quincy Adams did. And so John Quincy Adams appoints Henry Clay Secretary of State. Now, what's important here is that the Secretary of State back then was even more powerful than today. All 3 of the 4 preceding presidents had been Secretary of State before they became president. So you can see this is sort of a stepping stone to the presidency. And people saw this as sort of being a corrupt kind of way that John Quincy Adams got elected and Henry Clay helped him and he got something and John Quincy Adams got something, and who's left out is fairness, democracy. And so again, this is called the corrupt bargain. Okay, and it was a political disaster for John Quincy Adams for 4 years and during his first and only presidency. It's going to be a disaster because the other side is going to be fighting for revenge in this corrupt bargain for 4 years. So he's not going to get anything done. And even the common people are going to be looking for reasons to call out Quincy Adams on his corruptness and all this sort of stuff. There was a man that actually had a duel with Henry Clay. His name was John Randolph of Virginia. And John Randolph called Henry Clay a diseased Puritan. So you're going to see a lot of duels in this particular presentation we're going to talk about today. But just know that you've got a lot of the common people upset about the election of 1824. And it's even important to know that John Quincy Adams didn't have a third of the popular vote. So there wasn't a whole lot of support for him in the actual voting. And then after he appoints Henry Clay as Secretary of State, it becomes even worse for John Quincy Adams. So there's John Quincy. So what do you need to know about John Quincy Adams? Well, he ranks as one of the worst presidents, but one of the best Secretary of States. He was the first minority president. What we mean by that is he's the first man to win without the majority of electoral votes. So that's pretty interesting. We hear about presidents all the time who get elected without the popular vote, but not too many that get elected from not having the majority of the electoral votes. He didn't get rid of political appointees if they were doing a good job. So he didn't have a lot of support himself. He didn't have a lot of qualified candidates that he could select. So he looked at his cabinet, he looked at his other positions and said, if you're doing a good job, you can stay. He didn't have a lot of, like I said, great people on his side who could do the job. So again, for 4 years, they're going to be fighting John Quincy Adams to get him out of office and really support Andrew Jackson. But in all this 4 years, John Quincy Adams is not going to get a whole lot done. Doesn't have a lot of his own people. And now there's a lot of mudslinging, and really the campaign for the next presidential election has already begun, even like the first one ended. So John Quincy Adams, he was kind of a short, stocky person. He was 5'7". He was thick, set. He was bald. He was even more introverted than his father was. He was tactless. He was extremely smart, though. But again, he's not the gregarious person that the people want at this time. So what's happening here? The Republican Party is falling apart because of this election. John Quincy Adams' election marks the end of the era of good feelings. The country becomes even more sectionalist between the North and the South and the West. John Quincy Adams is a strong nationalist. He wanted to improve infrastructure in the United States. He wanted construction of roads and canals. He wanted a national university with federal support. He also wanted an astronomical observatory. So he really wants to grow America and grow their industry. But he's having problems doing that because of lack of support. Okay, he had problems with the Native Americans. He did his best to deal with them in a very diplomatic way, and he was criticized for this. He actually had met with the Cherokees in Georgia and tried to deal with them fairly. When we talk about Andrew Jackson a little bit later and the Trail of Tears, not the most diplomatic way to deal with Native Americans. So we're going to have a very different approach to Native Americans from John Quincy Adams as we had with Monroe when he sent Jackson into Florida. And we're going to have, obviously, with Jackson when he becomes president in 4 more years. So a problem that was still debated in the era of good feelings was the tariffs. And what you need to understand here is that the North favors tariffs. The North loves tariffs. The tariffs are going to protect the industry and they're going to protect the businesses of the North. The South, traditionally, and this is always the case really in American history, when we get into the late 1800s, we get into even today, 2019, we've got tariffs, and tariffs always cause problems with farmers. They have a lot of products, they do a lot of international trade, and so tariffs really hurt farmers. They always seem to help manufacturing. So the tariffs are going to be another a hotly contested thing during John Quincy Adams' administration. And the tariff in 1828 was called the Tariff of Abominations. That is a very harsh word to put on the end of tariffs. The South, again, hated them. They hurt their business. Made materials for farmers more expensive. It's expensive enough already to be a farmer. We're talking about buying equipment and buying things for livestock, things for the crops, and to add on tariffs just takes away from their bottom line. So it was a very high tariff. That's extremely important. And New England loved it. It was a great tariff for them. It went from 23% to 37%. Okay. That's basically saying that farmers now are going to they're losing that much profit. And whereas New England is going to gain that because it's going to cause the other goods that are coming into America to be 23 to 37% higher. So of course they're going to buy the goods that the Americans are producing as far as the manufactured goods. Again, this is just going to cost farmers more money because of equipment and things like that. So the South is very, very upset over this tariff. And this all happens under John Quincy Adams. Other reasons the South is upset, okay? Government interference. They had already seen the federal government interfere with slavery in Missouri. Remember Missouri Compromise? Maine becomes a free state. Missouri becomes a slave state. The British were starting to abolish slavery in the Caribbean. And then it's their last chance to sort of take a stand against the federal government having too much power. Again, slavery is a social, economic, and political issue. Driving slavery, though, at its core is an economic one. The South was dependent on slave labor for these cash crops, and so John Quincy Adams is angering them with these tariffs and all these other things are happening at the same time. So it's their last chance to make a stand against federal encroachment. And like I said, economic hardship is happening in the South because of the tariffs, which really hurt farmers. So the first state to take a stand is going to be, it's going to be South Carolina. They're going to take the lead in the protesting. And John Calhoun, in secret, is going to write something called the South Carolina Exposition, okay? Also known as Calhoun's Protest. It was written by John Calhoun. He's the vice president at the time. He can't openly write it because he's in a position of power and he's, sleeping next door to the president, as it were. And so he writes this and he denounces the tariff as being unjust and unconstitutional. And so Calhoun's protest again, the South Carolina Exposition becomes known really for its threat. Okay, South Carolina threatens to secede from the Union if the tariff is not repealed. And so this was inspired sort of from another idea that we talked about a while back called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolves. So let's sort of look at the basis for that. Again, the South Carolina Exposition takes its motivation from the Kentucky and Virginia Resolves. And to recap, if you don't remember what those were, remember these are the resolves that were against the Alien and Sedition Acts. Remember, the Federalists were trying to restrict who could become citizens, who could vote. And so people in the South were less educated. Most immigrants, when they came, were less educated. They were going to be anti-Federalist if and when they could become citizens. And so the Federalists, way back when, tried to prevent this from happening so the balance of power didn't tip. And so the Kentucky and Virginia Resolves, they were challenged as being unconstitutional. They stayed in place. But now we have a South Carolina Exposition, and they're going to do the same thing. They're going to challenge the constitutionality of this new tariff. Okay, so this new exposition, the South Carolina Exposition, is going to now say that states should nullify the tariff within their own borders. So South Carolina is not going to pay this tax to, or they're not going to take part in this tariff, which is going to cause other countries to pay more taxes. And again, this goes back to the theory of nullification, that states can invalidate unconstitutional federal laws, basically saying that if states don't like something because it goes against the Constitution, if it's not explicitly expressed in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, then states don't have to follow this federal law. They can actually invalidate it. And so it becomes a very scary time. And again, this is all kind of foreshadowing the secession that's going to precede the Civil War. Again, Calhoun, he's from the South. He's a Unionist. He wants to keep us together, but he's also a nationalist. He wants to expand and have national pride, but he's also a Southern sectionalist. So he's going to protect his constituents. And this is one of the things that they care about most is their economic well-being. Okay. And so this South Carolina Exposition takes place. John Calhoun, again, is the one who wrote it. He wanted to protect the minority in the South from the tyranny of the majority in the North and the West. However, this South Carolina Exposition was just a threat and nothing happened to it. It was a false alarm. No other state joined South Carolina in protest. Who knows what would happen if another state had, but it did foreshadow secession that was to come not too far away from now, actually. So let's talk about the election of 1898. Okay, so 4 years after John Quincy Adams becomes president, really, this election began the day after this corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay. Okay, it began in February of 1825. This is 4 years of revenge, sort of campaigning for Andrew Jackson. After the election, it caused the Democrat Republicans to split. Now you have two distinct parties. You're going to have the Nationalist Republicans, which are going to be the John Quincy Adams side, and then you're going to have the Democrat Party, which is the Andrew Jackson side. Okay, and the Democrat Party, their rallying cry again is going to be the corrupt bargain and all hail Old Hickory. So these sort of slogans are going to start immediately after the election of 1824. So in this election, there's a ton of mudslinging. Again, the idea is, should the people rule or should the president pick and choose who he wants to support him if they help him out? So people weren't happy with the way that John Quincy Adams was elected. Again, he only got a third of the popular vote. Okay, so there's going to be lots and lots of mudslinging in this particular election. And a lot of it's aimed towards John Quincy Adams. One of the interesting anecdotes was that he bought a chess set and a billiard table, like pool, with his own money. And Andrew Jackson and his supporters said that he was buying gambling tables and he was buying furniture for the presidential palace. So this is kind of a negative against John Quincy Adams for no reason. The biggest and saddest mudslinging was against Andrew Jackson and his wife. His wife was named Rachel Donaldson. The problem was Andrew Jackson and his wife, when they got married, Rachel Donaldson had not finalized her divorce yet. She thought it was finalized, her ex-husband had not signed the papers yet. So she was being criticized as being an adulteress, that she was some kind of harlot, and you can't have a harlot, sinner, adulteress as the first lady in the White House. It was pretty nasty. It was pretty nasty. Jackson himself was criticized for being a slave trader. And so it got kind of nasty. At one point, they even had duels between Jackson and others who criticized his wife. And the sad part is, his wife actually died before the election took place. People say she died of a broken heart. You know, you can Google it if you want to research more exactly how she died, but she did die. And one of the duels that happened to defend her honor was between Jackson and a man we talked about before. His name was John Sevier or Sevier. Okay, he was the governor of the state of Franklin, and we talked about that way back when. He had said some negative things about Andrew Jackson's wife, and so Andrew Jackson went out there. This time, though, the duel happened like it was supposed to happen, and nobody fired at each other. They fired like into the air, and then they hugged each other and said, "My bad." But still, this sort of illustrates the mudslinging that was happening in this election of 1828. So even after all this, Andrew Jackson wins overwhelmingly, especially in the West and the South. John Quincy Adams polled about 44% of the vote, which is fairly respectable, much better than he did last time. But Andrew Jackson becomes our president. So what's important about John Quincy Adams? After he loses the election of 1828, he went on to serve as a member of the House of Representatives for 17 years. And he famously quoted as saying, "No person can be degraded by serving the people." So he served for 17 years. He was an old man by the time he was a representative. And in 1841, he actually defended some slaves. And this is depicted in the movie Amistad. It was about slaves who actually were taken from Africa, and they were brought to the New World illegally, because at the time it was still, the British slave trade was illegal. And so at this time, the only way you could be a slave is if you were born into slavery. And so John Quincy Adams was selected to sort of defend these slaves and prove that they were in fact from Africa. And this happened 7 years before he died. So this happened in 1841. John Quincy Adams died at the age of 80 in 1848. So it is depicted in the movie Amistad. I'm sure it's true in real life too, that John Quincy Adams was notorious for sort of sleeping during meetings of the House of Representatives. But he did sort of serve out his usefulness as a politician more in the House than he ever did as a president. Okay. So what's important about this election of Jackson? Democracy is spreading. It's a source of pride to say that you come from humble beginnings, and that's what Jackson was. Many felt that he was the best person to lead the country because of his success fighting the Indians and fighting the British in the War of 1812. Remember, this is the Battle of New Orleans that Jackson is so famous for. So a lot of people look to sort of these populist candidates, a man of the people to lead, instead of, these aristocrats who own land and happen to be rich. Funny. Okay. So again, even though this is happening, we still have we have sort of a split. We've got the wealthy in the North, and we have the sort of ruralness and poor of the South and the West. So we have some splits in parties. We talked about the Democrat Republicans and the Democrats. So most of the high offices were led by leading citizens, but they had to get the common man's vote. Okay, this kind of sounds familiar. Our last few presidential elections, these are rich and powerful people, but they need the populist vote. And again, we've got two ideas here. We've got Jeffersonian democracy. These are the Democrat Republicans. People should be governed as little as possible, sort of small government idea. And then we have Jacksonian democracy, which is that people should rule directly. Okay, we're going to stop here for now, and we're going to pick up our next video lecture with Jacksonian democracy 2. Deuces.